Okay, guys, next section in chapter 2 is going to be talking about significant figures. And what significant figures are going to tell us is where we need to round our numbers to. So we can do whatever calculation we need to do or make whatever measurements we need to do. And the rules of sig figs, that's what I'm going to call them, sig figs, not significant figures. But the rules of sig figs are going to tell us what we need to do for rounding. Okay? So sig figs are going to tell us where to round calculated values based on the measurements that were taken to give us those numbers. Sig figs are going to give scientists another way to stay consistent. Okay, we talked about how we need to have a consistent way of making measurements. We need to have a consistent way of rounding numbers and writing numbers. Okay. Anything that's a given value in a question, a given value or a constant doesn't get rounded. And we have some rules that tell us how many sig figs are in any given number. Okay, so that's where we're going to go next. Our sig fig rules. Rule number 1 is that non-zero digits always count as significant. Okay, so we are always going to count. If a number is not 0, it counts as significant. So the number 2,341 grams. There are 4 digits in this number, and all 4 of them are significant. Okay, so there's 1 digit, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4 separate digits, and all of them are significant. Okay. Rule number 2 talks about zeros. And zeros, the second rule, rule number 2, is where things get really kind of a little bit tricky. Because rule number 1 makes sense. Anything that's not a 0, it matters. Okay? Those numbers are significant. Certain zeros are significant and certain zeros are not. So we need to figure out how to determine which zeros count. There's 3 types of zeros. The first is a leading zero. A leading zero is going to start a number. Zeros on the left-hand side of the number never count. They are not significant. They are just placeholders. Okay? So an example of this would be 0.0045 meters. This number right here has 2 significant figures. There's 1, there's 2, because these 3 zeros are on the left and they don't count. Okay? They are not significant, so we don't count them. We only count the non-zero digits in this case. Okay? So leading zeros on the left-hand side never count. The next type of zero is called a sandwich zero. Sandwich zeros are going to come in between non-zero digits, like these ones right here. Come in between this number and this number, or those 2 digits. Okay? So sandwich zeros always count. So if I was counting the number of sig figs in this value, there's 1, there's 2, 3, and 4, because these zeros count. They are significant. Okay? They're sandwich zeros. Trailing zeros is where it gets a little bit iffy. Okay? So trailing zeros are going to be zeros that end a number. Zeros that come after all of the other stuff. Trailing zeros count if the number has a decimal. Okay? If this number has a decimal point, then trailing zeros count. If it doesn't have a decimal point, then trailing zeros do not count. Okay? So let's look at some examples. This number 100 here, there are some trailing zeros right there, but there is no decimal point in this number. So this digit is the only one that is significant. So we would say that it has 1 sig fig for the number 100. Okay? I could put a decimal at the end of this number, and that's going to tell me, boom, now these numbers become significant, or these digits become significant. And so I go from 1 to 3 sig figs just by adding a decimal, because now these trailing zeros count. Then I could go even further and add a couple more zeros, and all of these are still considered trailing zeros because they come at the end of a number. But since there's a decimal point right there, all 5 of those digits, the 1, the 0, the 0, the 0, and the other 0, all count as significant. So there are 5 sig figs in that number. Okay? Then we get to rule number 3. Rule number 3 says that exact numbers have infinite sig figs, and that we don't need to worry about counting them. So basically what this is numbers that are obtained by counting, by definition, or by constants. Okay? An example would be like, oh, I see that you have 3 apples. That is exactly 3 apples, and I don't need to do anything with my sig figs because that is 3.000000, 0 forever, apples. Okay? This is a conversion or a definition. This number, we'll talk about this number later, but it is a constant. Okay? But basically the easiest way to remember this is counting. If I can count, oh, I have 1 pen in my hand, 1.0 pens, 1.00000 repeating forever pens in my hand. Okay? And so those sig figs are infinite. Okay? Let's practice a little bit. I'm going to give you some numbers. I want you to pause the video and count how many sig figs you see in each of those numbers. Okay? Pause it now and go. Okay. Welcome back. I'm going to put the answers up. So the first number has 4 sig figs. This 0, and I'm only going to talk about the zeros here, okay? Because the zeros are really the question marks. This is a sandwich 0. Sandwich zeros always count. So that tells us that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 significant figures. These 3 zeros for number 2 are leading zeros. Leading zeros never count. So I have 2 sig figs. This 0 right here is a trailing 0. Trailing zeros only count if there's a decimal. There's no decimal in this number. So my only 2 significant figures are those. For this one, I've got sandwich zeros, sandwich 0. This is a trailing 0, and it will count because there's a decimal in the number. Okay, so when I look at all that, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 significant figures. Here's another trailing 0. There's a decimal point, so it counts. I have 1, 2, 3 sig figs. Okay? We're going to stop here for this video. I'm going to make another one because I don't want to run out of time. But sig figs are super important, guys. The next time I see you or have an assignment or talk about questions with sig figs, they are super important, and we really have to understand them in order to do the math properly and make the rounding the right way as we go forward into our labs and our measurements and our homework and tests and quizzes. Okay? All right. That's it for this one.